Chapter 12, Section 3, Hoover's response fails. Why did Hoover's policies fail to slow the country's economic crisis? So, how his initial conservative response to the Depression failed, explain the changes in the president's policy as the crisis continued, and then describe how Americans reacted to Hoover's relief programs. So, when we look at this cautious response, again, this all goes back to Hoover's background, but it also goes to more conservative Republican policies. They are definitely more laissez-faire, hands off, let the market go. And the other thing to Hoover's in Hoover's defense, many experts just see this as one of many economic bumps in the road. This is pretty common. There's a panic, there's a bit of a depression. After a year or two, the United States claws its way back out. And so, this is just another one of those economic periods and not a big deal, and we'll get through it. After a couple of years, when they started to realize how deep this thing was and how bad it was, they knew they needed to act. He was really hoping people would work for the common good. He was really hoping factory owners would continue to employ employees, if not at full time, at least at partial time, or at least at partial wages. He looked to reduce taxes, lower interest rates, push public works programs. Volunteerism really fails to bring relief, and a lot of it is most people are going to respond to something like this, and they're going to protect themselves and their families first. And so there's too many people who are looking out for their own best self-interest, which again is very natural not to criticize or condemn these people, but business owners are going to look to try and protect their losses, and not very many of them are willing to hire people out of the goodness of their hearts. The other problem you run into is that this idea of volunteerism, the state and local governments are the ones who have to bear the brunt of all of this, and they just plain don't have enough resources to be able to pull this off. The other thing is Hoover has this unshakable belief in America's rugged individualism, that Americans are able and deserve to drag themselves up by their bootstraps, that if you do that, if you give handouts to Americans, you are going to undercut the very essence of what it means to be an American, which is to grit it out and tough it out and just work a little bit harder. And in this particular period of history, that just isn't going to be enough to be able to help lift us out of the Great Depression. So once he realizes by 1930 that this is not going the way that it needed to go, he gets the Reconstruction Finance Corporation put in place. This is going to give loans to railroads, to extremely large businesses, and the biggest banks. And so the idea, if you see this cartoon, you see Herbert Hoover dumping money from this public finance corporation and this Public Construction Act, and you see Uncle Sam pumping away, and that all of this money is going to lead to employment, and it's going to fuel the fire of American industry. The idea here is that wealth is going to trickle from the top to the bottom. The other thing, when you see, for example, a public works program, this is when the Hoover Dam gets built. This is one of the items that actually is pretty successful, are these big public works programs. The American government is going to spend the money to build this enormous Hoover Dam. And what the Hoover Dam is going to do is it's going to employ thousands of people for a number of years. And the other thing to keep in mind is when you're building the Hoover Dam, all of the steel, all of the cement that's required to build it is going to help fuel construction in other places. And the other thing too is with this, you're going to have people who are living in the area who are spending money in the local area, and that's going to put money into the local economy. That's going to jumpstart the local economy, and eventually that's going to kind of spread its way to neighboring economies. So really, this is going to start at the small consumer, and it's going to float its way up, which is the way money really tends to go. When you look at how to really describe Hoover's policies, the best description here is probably too little, too late. It wasn't soon enough, and because he waited so long, even when some of these things did start to work, so many people lost faith in President Hoover. How do Americans respond to this? his failures. This is when you look at criticisms of the New Deal for FDR and also for Hoover, it's important to realize that on the far left and the far right, I don't believe either of those criticisms are very fair, because when you look at the far left, they are saying that both Roosevelt and Hoover aren't going nearly far enough. They want radical change. They want the government to take over everything, socialism and communism. And when you look at the far right, they're making arguments that the government has expanded way too much and that they're doing way too much to help the American people, that this needs to be an individual, local, and state issue. They just didn't have the resources to be able to do that. Really, the final nail in Hoover's coffin is the bonus army. World War I vets had been promised a $1,000 bonus 10 years, I believe, after their military service was up. For World War I veterans, you start to get someone who's beginning to organize. And his argument is, if we give $1,000 to all of these World War I vets now during the Great Depression, that would put millions of dollars into the economy. And so they wanted their World War I bonuses early. It passed the House of Representatives, but it did not pass the Senate. And hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of World War I vets had marched to Washington, D.C. to convince Congress to pass this. And then when they didn't pass it, so after this was over, they didn't go home right away. And it starts to worry Hoover that these guys are milling around Washington, D.C. He orders the bonus army out, and Douglas MacArthur takes it upon himself to disperse these World War I veterans. He probably goes beyond the force that was necessary to do this. He ends up burning down the Hooverville that these guys were living in. A few people get injured pretty badly. A couple of people die. World War I veterans die. A young child dies. And this really kind of dooms Hoover, because he gets blamed for this thing that happened with the bonus army. And so when we go into the election in 1932, when FDR, who's campaigning at this time, sees what happens with the bonus army, he basically shuts down all of his campaigning, because he realizes that the only thing he can do at that point is lose the election. Hoover has pretty much won the election for FDR.